Alright, the return of apocalypse. Climate change comprises a broad range of physical, atmospheric, and material changes to the Earth and the atmosphere. It also operates as a set of discourses signifying ideas about the future, resource use, quote, the global and end quote, and personal responsibility, often through the lens of impending crisis. These futures are fundamentally dystopian, characterized by dramatic sea level rise, disappearing coastlines, intense heat waves, and extreme storms. Okay, so she's not denying these things happen, by the way. The author isn't doing that. She's pointing out these are excuses to, uh, you know, lower the population. And obviously, the attention should be elsewhere at the fossil fuel industry. But, anyways, just wanted to point that out because I can see that there is some pages that don't fully disclose that context and distinction. So just putting that out there. All right. Okay. Yet the future is also already here. Climate change is already disrupting ecological systems and human societies. It is already killing people via heat waves, storms, and other disasters. Nutritional deficiencies, the intensified spread of infectious diseases, and even chronic disease. The effects are so magnificent that in 2009 a group of global health researchers declared climate change the biggest threat to human health in the 21st century. Against the backdrop, Bill McKibben published a widely read 2012 Rolling Stone article that described the, quote, peril that human civilization is in, arguing that we're losing the fight badly and quickly, end quote. By crunching a few numbers, he laid out the predicament. Human beings are pouring far more gigatons of carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere far more rapidly than expected. In order to remain under the 2 degrees Celsius warning limit agreed by the world leaders, we would need to add no more than 565 more gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by mid-century. As of the date of McKibben's article, we were on track to add more than 2,700 additional tons. Several years later, he followed up with a second, markedly more aggressive message. This time, he likened climate change to war, arguing that, quote, World War III is well and truly underway and we are losing. By most of the ways we measure wars, climate change is the real deal. Carbon and methane are seizing physical territory, sowing havoc and panic, racking up casualties, and even destabilizing governments. It is not that global warming is like a world war, it is a world war, end quote. Even more terrifying, the war he described was not a war of winners and losers, but rather a zero-sum game in which we will inevitably be decimated. McKibben's prescription for response? Meet fire with fire, declaring a war on climate change and mobilizing the kind of response marshaled during World War II. Climate change discourses are often communicated in this apocalyptic, doom and gloom language. They are organized around the idea of planetary emergency, and if those listeners do not retreat into denialism, the focus on crisis is a powerful strategy. It can, quote, mobilize powerful actors around the threat of massive risks and uncertainties, end quote. It can also open up the possibilities of solutions that are otherwise unacceptable, including population control. In 2006, a group of bioethicists published an article identifying climate change as one of the most important moral problems of the day, due to its urgency and widespread harmful impacts. Their solution? Population engineering, defined as international manipulation of population size and structure. So it's, I mean, it depends on what the population is using as material produced by capitalism. Like, it's not human numbers and humans by themselves. It's obviously what they're using. So this has nothing to do with numbers. Like, obviously, the more human numbers that are using a specific product that's destroying a certain part of the world, that makes sense, but it's not numbers per se at all. Okay, so, um, human engineering, quote, a practical and morally justifiable means to help ameliorate the threat of climate change, end quote. The basis of their argument is the following. Population growth and climate change are both proceeding in ways that have destructive impacts on the availability and quality of natural resources, and current international climate mitigation policies and technologies are insufficient to prevent the kinds of CO2 emissions that lead to rapid warming. Planning for climate change mitigation while remaining at current population growth rates is both impossible and morally indefensible, given the global spread and depths of the impact global warming is having on the planet. Thus, some level of population engineering is required to address the urgency of the climate change. Here is where their arguments become dangerous. They state that, due to the emergency of the climate problem, the best interventions are neither those that are the least coercive nor the most, but those somewhere in the middle. Achieving quick climate stability results morally justifies actions that are along a coercive continuum. After all, they remind us, quote, we don't have the luxury of solving a problem at a leisurely pace, end quote. Specifically, the authors advocate a, quote, global population engineering program, end quote, comprised of an expansion of choice-enhancing interventions such as women's education and comprehensive reproductive health care, along with preference adjustment, changing cultural norms and influencing childbearing preferences, as well as incentivization, altering the costs and benefits associated with particular reproductive health behaviors. Ironically, they conclude that the statement that reducing childbearing is a more attractive climate change mitigation strategy than reducing resource consumption because it is easier, thus helping individuals avoid making unnecessary personal sacrifices. The article encapsulates many of the arguments writers and scholars are making today, namely that population growth is an important cause of climate change, that slowing population growth will be an effective means of slowing GGEs, and that the urgency of the global climate problem morally justifies, even requires a narrow focus on fertility reduction. Where it departs from others is in the author's willingness to consider coercion as morally justifiable in the service of the greater good. However, this is not an unfamiliar argument within environmental circles. In the 1960s and 1970s, in the heyday of public advocacy of population control, environmental scientists openly called for coercive measures, including punitive taxes and other population control policies. More recently, drawing on militaristic language similarly to McKibben's, members of the defense community have increasingly described climate change as the national security threat and talk of impending climate wars. The narrative of apocalypse is frightening, not just in what it describes, but what it makes possible, including military maneuvers, increasing surveillance, and policies of borders and racial profiling of migrants and refugees. This is linked to another development industry population narrative, the youth bulge theory. Youth bulge theory says that in populations with large proportions of youth, particularly adolescents and young adults, access to employment and social services is limited, fueling frustration among disaffected young people, rendering youth susceptible to recruitment in rebel or terrorist organizations, and making the societies they live in more vulnerable to social unrest and violence. The theory describes populations that, with age structures that skew heavily toward youth, with young people in their 20s or younger comprising more than a fifth of the overall population. I am pretty sure we have no close to this type of problem at all. Anyways, of course, the vast majority of countries with these age structures are in the global south. Oh. The theory is meant to be frightening and to invoke fear of the other. The Newsday article describes it thus, quote, dangerous demographic trend typified by the massive youth bulge, an extraordinary high proportion of young people among the population, all but guarantee increased social instability that fewer dreams will be able to withstand. End quote. Similar discourses have been circulated 20 years prior. In the National Security Council reports in 1974 described young people who are in much higher proportions in many less developed countries who are likely to be more volatile, unstable, prone to extremes, alienation, and violence than an older population. End quote. Population researchers and NGO program managers have been paying more and more attention to the youth bulge theory in the context of recent international focus on two issues, terrorism and climate change. Take, for example, a 2010 report by Population Action International on youth bulge theory, the shape of things to come, why age structure matters to a safer, more equitable world. The report argues that, quote, the threats to the well-being and security of our world, from HIV and AIDS and terrorism to climate change and poverty, requires a bold mix of interventions and partnerships that combine elements of both hard and soft power. The report describes terrorism, security concerns, and fragile or failing states as resulting from youth-heavy population age structures, adding that age structures can and should be shaped through, quote, policies that affect the demographic forces, i.e. birth, death, and migration, that determine these age structures, end quote. Namely, policies that support family planning. This approach to, quote, strategic demography, end quote, was replicated just 2 years later when a group of researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, convened a meeting to discuss how to prevent, quote, a huge humanitarian catastrophe, end quote, from occurring in the Horn of Africa. Over 100 people gathered to review population projections and models of climate-driven food and water shortages, and to pore over data arguing that rapid population growth, extreme temperatures, and expected drought would likely create conditions leading to, quote, the largest involuntary migration in history, end quote. The solutions proposed at the meeting focused on agricultural adaptation, water management and predictability, voluntary family planning for women delivered through a human rights approach, arguing that, quote, these interventions must be immediate and on a large scale, end quote. These discourses make it clear that members of the population network are nimble in applying the Cairo consensus approach to family planning to a broad range of conditions, and in doing so, they harness the exact kinds of discourses Cairo activists worked so hard to reject. Operating within a discourse of entrenched gender stereotypes of dangerous Southern men, they harness a powerful set of images that have already taken root in the U.S. policymaking groups and in the national psyche. In an era when terrorist threats are perceived around every corner, when terrorist attacks are quickly used to racially profile young men from the Middle East and Africa, and when this generalized perception of Muslim-led terror becomes embedded in the U.S. policy in the form of travel bans and refugee exclusion, youth bulges operate as an explanatory framework for racialized framings of population problems. They also make a case for the familiar technology quick fix contraceptives. Conclusion. This chapter demonstrates how population narratives and discourses, far from silent or invisible, are continually revived through popular media, development interventions, and various forms of policy advocacy. Climate change, however, is making these narratives more salient, visible, and arguing in the era of heightened environmental and social risk. Characterized population through crisis narratives has a long history among neo-Malthusians, particularly those tasked with developing scientific theories that link population to environmental problems and policy solutions. Chapter 2 delves into these questions, investigating the key factors in constructed populations as a scientific environmental problem across the 20th century, and the roles of politics and policy agendas in the process. Alright, that should be cool. Alright, I'll see you in the next chapter.